It's time to dust off that old globe of yours that's been rotting out in the garage or the basement and join us on a virtual trip around the world. In fact, 3 trips around the world, alongside a notorious buccaneer of the 17th century who was also variously a captain in the Royal Navy, a naturalist, and a writer and chronicler of places that were little known or unknown to Western travelers. A very interesting bloke indeed, who lived a truly storybook life. Oh, and did I mention he was also the first Englishman to set foot on what we now know as Australia, as well as the man who helped rescue the marooned Robinson Crusoe. And if you're hungry, would you believe that he was also the first person to introduce barbecue, chopsticks, cashews, and guacamole to the Occidental world? Hello again, friends, and welcome to Lost and Unfound, where we tell the true tales of the formerly famous, the infamous, and the forgotten. I'm Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. Well, enough with the tease. Let's get straight to our subject today, and that is the pirate, sea captain, explorer, amateur scientist, writer, and foodie, and that's William Dampier. Though the precise date of his birth is unknown, we do know via baptismal records that he was born in East Coker, Somerset, England, in 1651 into modest means. And this is the same quiet village from which the great writer and poet T.S. Eliot traces his ancestry and his family's immigration to the American colonies at around the same time. He attended King's School in nearby Bruton, which remarkably remains in existence as a school to this day. Orphaned at 16, he first went to sea where he would spend a majority of his swashbuckling life. His first voyage was aboard a merchant vessel to the frozen waters of Newfoundland, followed by another merchant mission to the other side of the world, and that was to decidedly warmer waters of Java, now Indonesia. Little to nothing, though, is recorded of these voyages. In 1673, still in his early 20s, he joined the Royal Navy and saw action at the battles of Schooneveld, which were a series of naval clashes between a combined Franco-Anglo flotilla and their then Dutch opponents off the coast of Holland. These skirmishes saw major fighting that involved roughly 60 to 80 warships on either side. It was generally considered a stalemate, if not a nominal Dutch victory. But it was during this stage of his early life that Dampier began to suffer from a mysterious but very grave illness, which would keep him from the open seas for the few years that followed. But always a wandering soul, he was determined to remain abroad. He somehow found his way to distant lands, where he worked various land-bound jobs, including plantation management in Jamaica and logging in Mexico. Logging in Mexico? Seems like British North America would have been better suited for that, but to each their own. Back home in England for a brief stay, he married in 1679, but domestic life did not suit him, and later that same year he was back to the seafaring life that would forever define him. In all, Dampier goes down as the first man to circumnavigate the globe on an incredible 3 separate occasions. Now this is really quite the achievement, especially made all the more miraculous considering the time in which he lived and the brutal conditions of life on board. These were not cruise ships, folks. Though records are unreliable and disputed, the average life of a mariner on the uncharted sea in this era was probably no greater than 30. If a sailor didn't die of disease, which he usually did, he would have typically been cut down in battle or by starvation, drowning, corporal punishment, and any other number of lethal risks. To paraphrase the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who was still barely alive himself at this time, quote, "Life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." And this was especially so for a sailor on the high seas during these years. So after a very short break, let's take a closer look at these fantastical travels and do our best to describe what he saw, learned, and recorded on each of his voyages. first grand odyssey of Dampier kicked off during the year of his marriage, 1679, when he joined the crew of the buccaneer, aka pirate, Bartholomew Sharp, aboard his vessel, the Trinity, which was then docked in Central America. And before we delve deeper, let's just take a quick minute here to try to better define and divine assorted terms that have forever been ascribed to Dampier: pirate, buccaneer, and privateer. Are these loosely used terms synonymous with one another? Well, the nomenclature can get tricky, so let's try to gain a cursory understanding of what each of these terms mean. We all have the comic and romantic image of a pirate: the bandana, the eye patch, the scabbard at the hip, the black flag, the rotten teeth, the skull and crossbones, and so on. The Johnny Depp character that we all know. Well, despite the sometimes slapstick embellishment of Hollywood and endless chroniclers that came before, piracy itself was very real. It essentially involved mariners previously involved in organized navies and other legitimate nautical merchant enterprises going rogue, as it were, and operating outside the law in search of adventure and plunder on their own terms. Therefore, the only real difference between a brigand or highwayman and a pirate is that one practiced their dirty deeds on land and the other at sea. And then there's the buccaneer. Are they the same? Think of Blackbeard, aka Edward Teach, who was a contemporary of Dampier, who sailed some of the same waters and pillaged some of the same lands. Well, the short answer is yes. The term derives from the French word boucan, which is essentially a grill for smoking meat. Wait, were these guys cannibals? No, not likely. The bastardization of the word was ascribed to French pirates operating out of Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, in the early 17th century. When not attacking wayward sailing vessels in those parts, they sustained themselves by grilling wild game, and so the term stuck. And then there were the privateers, who were essentially pirates with papers. Think of them as quasi-independent commercial seafaring enterprises, backed by deep pockets with the tacit or sometimes direct support of the crown. Some of the most notorious privateers were Sir Francis Drake and the ruthless John Hawkins on the English side, Robert Surcouf and Jean Bart for the French, and Miguel Enriquez and Amaro Pargo for Spain. But all seafaring nation-states of the period engaged in this practice. Their job was to make things very difficult for the particular enemy of the nation at hand, and shake them down for all they were worth, and then share the spoils to add to the royal coffers back home. It is in this capacity that Dampier spent the majority of his career. The first expedition took him to Campeche in Mexico, and the Isthmus of Darien in modern-day Panama in search of loot and booty around the Spanish Main. Not the first or the last Englishman to look for booty in that part of the world. Several of their raids were successful, including the capture of a Spanish galleon carrying 60,000 pieces of eight, meant as payment for soldiers in Panama. So they're off to a decent start. They then slipped down into Chile and Peru, but their raids there were largely fruitless, as the Spanish authorities were wise to their presence and were able to repel most of their scattered attacks. Sharp's leadership began to be questioned, and though there was no love lost between the combatants, his treatment of his Spanish prisoners was considered too harsh for even the old salts who witnessed it, and were forced to participate in the brutality. He also regularly had members of his own crew put in shackles, and a few of them hanged for insubordination. After personally murdering a Spanish friar on board in front of his own crew, the privateers had seen enough and had Sharp forcibly removed from his position and taken below deck. It was at this point that Dampier and dozens of others aboard the ship bolted this project, correctly considering it doomed. Sharp and his remaining crew that was loyal to him would continue to terrorize the South American coast before being taken prisoner by the Spanish. He eventually died in prison at St. Croix in the Danish Caribbean in 1702, but not after going down to history as a footnote, being the first Englishman to cross Cape Horn. Dampier turned up in Virginia in 1683, where he rendezvoused with another notorious privateer, John Cook, who had been a fellow traveler, literally, on Sharp's Trinity expedition. Joined by at least another 70 buccaneers, they sailed first to Guinea, along the western slave coast of Africa, harassing Spanish vessels along the way. They then sailed the other direction, this time around Cape Horn, again raiding Spanish possessions in Peru, the Galapagos Islands, and eventually Mexico and Central America, where Cook died of disease there the following year. In 1686, Dampier then joined the crew of another privateer, Charles Swan, and his vessel, the Signet. So after several years raiding the coast of the America, he's now off to even deeper and unknown horizons on his way to the East Indies. But after failing to subdue the Manila treasure galleon off the Filipino coast, Swan too fell out of favor as rations began to run dry. And that's a huge understatement, as the crew not only threatened a mutiny, but to... Gotta have a drum roll here, Mr. Producer. Cannibalized the captain and his loyal lieutenants, including Dampier. Whether it's an old salty yarn or not, we don't know, but the portly Swan was said to have pled with the mutineers that the lean Dampier would not have made for good eating. Well, I guess you can't have a good pirate story without mutiny and cannibalism, so there you go. Take it or leave it. What we do know is that the Signet did make it to the Philippines, and nobody was eaten by the hangry crew. But Captain Swan was bludgeoned to death by natives on a beach there in 1690. And this is an eerie foretelling of a very similar fate that would befall the great sea captain James Cook in Hawaii some 100 years later. Following Swan's swan song, Dampier found himself in command of a captured Spanish ship, which had been taken as a prize after fierce fighting off of Manila. They set sail to modern-day Vietnam, China, the Spice Islands, and eventually Australia, which was then known to Europeans as New Holland. They docked in what is now known as King Sound in northwest Australia, and remained there roughly 2 months in early 1688. And it was there that Dampier began to compile copious notes on the flora and fauna and the peoples of this unfamiliar land. His written recollections of this landing are controversial today, most notably descriptions of the Aboriginal peoples he encountered there. He writes of them,
"The inhabitants of this country are the miserablest in the world. Setting aside their human shape, they differ but little from brutes. They are of a very unpleasing aspect, having not one graceful feature in their faces."
After departing Australia, he found himself marooned with 2 others on Nicobar, which is an island off current-day India. Why they were banished there is not entirely clear, but it has been written that he oddly requested this fate. But the trio somehow managed to retrofit a canoe and made their way to Sumatra, where they hung out for about a year, and from there they sailed back to England in 1691. He arrived back home completely broke and unknown, with the exception of one possession, a heavily tattooed slave called Gioli. Whether Dampier bought this young man or saved him from captivity remains in some dispute, but my research suggests to me that it's sadly the former. He wrote in his journals and eventual narratives that the two had formed a bond during their long and arduous travels at sea. Perceive that as you may. Nevertheless, desperate and destitute, Dampier sold his, quote, friend to the Blue Boar Inn on Fleet Street in London, only to have him paraded around town as Prince Giolo. Not so surprisingly, the slave who would be prince perished of smallpox a mere 3 months later. His skin was removed, and hung in display at the anatomy school at Oxford University for hundreds of years following. In 1697, Dampier's chronicles of his first circumnavigation were published under the title of A New Voyage Round the World, and it made waves among the chattering classes. All apologies there for the bad pun. This book, now largely forgotten, had a great influence, though, in its time and on succeeding generations. It greatly influenced Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, and many have suggested that the book's protagonist, Captain Lemuel Gulliver, was indeed based on Dampier himself. It's also thought that these writings played a pivotal role in two other major works of British literature, Samuel Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. These recollections also had a direct impact on Charles Darwin, who included it in his library aboard the Beagle, and frequently references Dampier's notes on the Galapagos Islands in his writings. Darwin was particularly fond of the term subspecies, which Dampier himself had incredibly coined during his first visits to the Americas. But Dampier's life as a buccaneer was controversial within the Royal Admiralty, and though he was kept at arm's length, he was eventually handed the command of the 26-gun warship HMS Roebuck in the summer of 1698. The ship's mission was to map and better understand New Holland, again, now Australia, and Dampier was considered the best man for the job. He had originally been assigned the warship Jolly Prize, but after careful inspection, he deemed it too tattered and unseaworthy for such a long and demanding voyage. And probably due to his connections within the Admiralty, especially with the former naval officer and famous diarist Samuel Pepys, he was awarded a newer vessel, the Roebuck. The Roebuck set sail in January of the following year with the intention of heading around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, but reversed course, mostly due to weather, to instead go there via Cape Horn in South America. The voyage was racked with trouble almost from the outset, as tensions quickly grew between the captain and some of his subordinates, especially the first lieutenant by the name of George Fisher. Things came to a head off the coast of Brazil when Dampier had Fisher caned in front of the crew, cast in irons, and then marooned for fear of mutiny by those that questioned his rule by an iron hand. In August of said year, the Roebuck finally reached the westernmost tip of New Holland. Dampier named the place of his landing the rather unimaginative Shark Bay, which today is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, renowned for its unique flora and fauna and marine life. It was here that he and his crew collected many specimens, heretofore unknown to the Occident. And this increased his reputation back home as a fearless explorer, and sometimes he is still referred to controversially as Australia's first natural historian. Roebuck then went on to peruse the coasts of Timor, Papua New Guinea, collecting more intriguing specimens as they went. But the condition of the ship was now foundering badly, and this forced Dampier to abandon his plans and orders to further explore the remainder of the Australian continent, as was the mission. So instead they embarked on a shorter route to attempt to locate the remnants of the shipwreck of a vessel of the English East Company called the Trial. This merchant ship had sunk off the Australian coast in 1622, being the first European ship known to have done so. Of the roughly 150 crew aboard that ship, about 100 died, with the remaining finding their way by longboat and skiff to present-day Indonesia. Dampier had no luck locating it, and it would take more than 300 years for the wreck to be located. But speaking of shipwrecks, the Roebuck was soon to get its own comeuppance. The ship and its crew were in a sorry state, to say the least, at this point, but managed to sail on to Batavia, now Jakarta, reaching port there where repairs were made to the very precarious state of the HMS Roebuck. In the winter of 1701, they reached the remote outpost of St. Helena, famous as the exile and resting place of Napoleon roughly a century later, and then from there went on to Ascension Island, amongst the most desolate places on the globe, then and now. And that would prove to be the end of the doomed ship, as it was abandoned there, only to be recovered again 300 years later, where the bits and pieces of it were identified in 2001. Dampier and the survivors were rescued by a crew of an East Indiaman ship, which would have been composed of various nations and nationalities trading in the area. And they were then transported back to England. I guess it's not a surprise that the privateer, buccaneer, pirate, turned captain did not receive a hero's welcome by those back at the Admiralty. In fact, he was slapped with an unfortunate and unexpected response. Though he had made valuable contributions to the better understanding of the lands to which he was dispatched, and he kept most of his crew alive, the voyage was considered a failure by those at the top. In 1702, he found himself court-martialed, and the verdicts read as follows. Number 1, William Dampier, Captain, HMS Roebuck. Crime, death of John Norwood, boatswain. Verdict, acquitted. 2, George Fisher, Lieutenant, HMS Roebuck. Crime, dispute between the captain and the lieutenant. Verdict, acquitted. 3, William Dampier, Captain, HMS Roebuck. Crime, hard and cruel usage of the lieutenant, and that being George Fisher. Verdict, guilty. Sentence, forfeiture of all pay due and deemed unfit to command all His Majesty's ships. Though he was 2 for 3 on the court-martial, he was relieved of his official capacities within the apparatus of the Royal Navy. Dampier's next movements, though, suggest he was neither defiant nor dejected, but instead he gets back to business. The following year, he published another account of his most recent travels entitled A Voyage to New Holland. The book was also very popular with the reading public of the day, and also mostly well received by the critics. Though around 50 at this time, he showed no signs of slowing down and was instead appointed commander of a privateering enterprise composed of 2 ships, the St. George and the aptly named Cinque Ports, as we'll soon find out. And a quick footnote here, Cinque Ports derives from the French cinq ports and refers to 5 important port towns in southeastern England. But whether you want to call it Cinque Ports in English or Cinque Ports in French, it seems like a laughably bad name for a sailing vessel. On board this twin flotilla were just under 200 men and carried a combined 42 guns. Its primary purpose, as usual, was to harass and plunder French and Spanish ships and their foreign possessions. This commission was a direct reaction and response to the War of the Spanish Succession, which was in its early stages but would eventually claim the lives of more than 1 million people, mostly soldiers and sailors, in a roughly 15-year period. The ship set sail from Ireland in September of 1703 en route to South America and Cape Horn. They engaged in several skirmishes over the following months, salvaging only small booty and sustaining few casualties. Dampier's primary aim seems to have been to attack and seize the Spanish port town of Santa Maria off the Gulf of Panama, where rumor had it that vast amounts of gold were held there. But the attacks were surprisingly and successfully repelled. It was at this point, in May 1704, that the 2 ships parted company, and the reasons for this remain a little bit cloudy. But this parting proved to be apocryphal, as some would argue, as it led to one of history's greatest seafaring tales, and that is the marooning of Alexander Selkirk, the likely study as the protagonist of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. The Scottish privateer had continuously questioned the seaworthiness of the Cinque Port, and for this he was cast away, of his own choosing again, by the ship's 21-year-old captain, Thomas Stadling. He was banished to the then uninhabited and remote Juan Fernandez Islands, which lay about 400 miles off the coast of Chile, where he would famously live as a hermit for 4 years and 4 months before being rescued. And we'll revisit that shortly. Well, I'm no expert on the details, but the legend of Selkirk, aka Robinson Crusoe, remains a cherished and widely read tale to this day. What we do know, however, is that Selkirk's protestations were correct, as the doomed Cinque Ports was soon shipwrecked off the coast of Colombia, only to have the surviving sailors captured and imprisoned by their Spanish enemies. Well, now we're down to one ship, and its fate was also in peril. Dampier and the St. George moved next to attack the formidable Spanish flotilla called the Manila Galleon in December. And once again, following savage fighting, Dampier's privateers were outwitted and outgunned, and forced to retreat empty-handed. This marked the effective end of this ill-fated expedition, and a majority of the sailors abandoned the captain to eventually find their way to the closest Allied Dutch settlements, and then back home to England. Dampier and his remaining crew were forced to say adios to the badly ravaged St. George once and for all, and they too reached the East Indies, where they were briefly imprisoned and then allowed to return to Limeyland in late 1707. Now back home again, and despite an admittedly spotty record, there's no stopping old Billy D. He didn't seem to have time to polish or embellish his questionable resume before he was soon offered a position on another privateering tandem called the Duke and the Duchess. Now those two seem to have a better ring to them than the Cinque Ports. But this time he was not offered command, but rather pilot of the Duke. But this drop in rank doesn't seem to quell his wanderlust in the least, and within a few more short months, he's off again to the high seas. This expedition was under the financial control and naval command of Woodes Rogers, a colorful character who was alternately a privateer, a businessman, and twice the future colonial governor of the Bahamas. And I guess 3 times the charm, as this final circumnavigation would prove to be highly lucrative to its financial backers, if not Dampier himself. This voyage was notable for a few reasons. One, it netted roughly 30 million pounds of plundered goods off the Mexican coast in today's money. And 2, it rescued our old friend, the poor lonely hermit, Alexander Selkirk Robinson Crusoe. Both of these events took place in 1709. After completing another trip around Cape Horn, this cruise made further stops in Guam, Batavia, and other countless places with which Dampier would have been familiar. And after sailing past the Cape of Good Hope, both ships arrived back to London in October 1711. His disembarkation at the docks of the River Thames marked the end of his long and colorful life at sea, and effectively began the countdown to his eventual death a few years later. What had been an unimaginably exciting life gave way to a rather anticlimactic end. He spent his final days in obscurity, squabbling in court along with the other sailors of his final voyage over the spoils owed to them from the considerable haul of the Spanish galleon. In death, as in birth, the exact date of his passing is unknown, but we do know that he died in London in 1715 in his 63rd year. Though largely forgotten today, he left in his wake an incredibly colorful life, a massive catalog of scientific and naval discovery, and 2,000 pounds in debt. And if you'd like to learn more about Dampier in greater detail, I highly recommend the 2005 book, A Pirate of Exquisite Mind, by Diana and Michael Preston.
This concludes the latest episode of Lost and Unfound. Keep watching on YouTube or find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all the socials. New episodes drop regularly. And if you like what you see, please subscribe. It really does help us create new and fresh content. And be sure to check out our companion site, Well Hung History, where we tell true tales of the condemned and the executed. Copyright Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.